So welcome. We're going to get started with our webinar, Using Adolescent Development to Inform Prevention Practice, Brain and Behavior. This, as a disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the Mountain Plains PTTC under the cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. All materials appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from the cooperated sources, is in the public domain. And you could read the rest of that on your own. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Jason Burrow-Sánchez. Dr. Jason Burrow-Sánchez is a professor of counseling psychology and the chair of the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. He is also the director of the Mountain Plains Region 8 Prevention Technology Transfer Center, which is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at the University of Utah. His research interests include the prevention and treatment of substance use for adolescents in school and community settings. His research has been funded at local, state, and national levels, and he has published numerous articles, chapters, and books. He is also a licensed psychologist in the state of Utah. I will now turn the time over to our presenter, Dr. Jason Burrow-Sánchez.
Thank you, Taylor, and welcome everybody. I see people joining in, and I know we have folks across the US joining us, so welcome wherever you're coming from and whatever time zone you're in, whether it be the morning or the afternoon, depending on where, or the lunch hour. So the first thing I wanted to do is also thank you for coming and joining us today and spending some time with us, and also thank our PTTC staff for allowing us to get this webinar off the ground. Producing these products and so forth always takes a lot of effort, so I want to thank everybody on our staff for doing that. The other thing is I like to give away free stuff, so here's my first free thing that I'll give you away. This slide you see is our PTTC Mountain Plains website. You can go here. We have a lot of products on here in terms of recorded webinars, downloadable materials, specific pages on substances such as alcohol, e-cigarettes, and cannabis, info for upcoming trainings, and also you can join our listserv. So please make use of that. It's all free to you, as well as the presentation that we do today. This webinar and future webinars will be posted on here as well. So anyway, make use of that. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to cover a bit of material today. I'm probably going to go a little bit fast, but that's okay. I want to make sure we get to some points, but my goal today is to make this practical and useful for you in the context of prevention. And the way we're going to start is we're going to look at some use rates, and these are 12th grade use rates. And one of the questions I commonly get asked is what are adolescents using? What are youth using? And these are from the Monitoring the Future data from 2019 and 2020, so fairly recent. And what you can see from this slide is pretty simply is that cannabis, alcohol, and e-cigarettes for both years are the three most commonly used substances. And that tends to be the case nationally. That will also tend to be the case in the states that you're in, although I don't have state-based data for your individual state because you're coming across all 50 states. If you look at your state-based data, it may not exactly match up, like, cannabis or alcohol may be slightly higher and so on and so forth. But the piece remains that for the most part, cannabis, alcohol, and e-cigarettes were the most frequently used substances in youth. That is. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out is in terms of when we look across grades, and this is also Monitoring the Future data, looked at a little differently between 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, we can see that there tends to be a trend, an increasing trend based on age or grade, and age or grade are highly correlated, meaning that as kids get older, clearly they usually end up in a higher grade. So whichever variable you want to use, either age or grade, will increase across time. Also, the likelihood of use will increase across time. So put simply, you can see that more youth report using in 12th grade than they do in 8th grade, and so forth. This is also, if you consider this graph conceptually, it's also a take-home message. So we also ask, when should we do prevention? Well, clearly we know that 8th graders, and in some studies we go as early as 6th graders, and we know that prevention should probably start early. There's no reason to wait. Meaning understanding what prevention looks like, teaching kids about prevention, and we're going to talk about what some of those concepts are today, is really important. And the earlier we start is the better. So I'm going to try to give you some points along the way as we go. The other thing I forgot to mention at the forefront is that if you have questions and so forth, Taylor will be monitoring the chat or the Q&A rather, and we'll get to those at the end, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can based on the time that we have. Okay, so if we take the data from the first two slides I showed you, and I like to facilitate things and look at them different ways, I'm also going to put it in a concept of a triangle. So basically, if we think about this slide where it had the 12th grade data, and I said the most frequently used substances are cannabis, alcohol, and e-cigarettes. So if we take that data on average and we say, well, at the top part of the triangle, between 20 to 30% of adolescents are using any one of those substances. The opposite side, or the flip side of that, would suggest that about 70 to 80% of adolescents are not using particular substances. And this is data based in the past 30 days. So the good news here is that there's a large proportion of adolescents that indicate not using substances in the past 30 days. And what's the big deal about the past 30 days? Well, in terms of survey research, we consider the past 30 days frequent use or current use, as where you can also see it measured in the past year or lifetime use. Lifetime use we kind of consider experimental use, have they ever used it in their lifetime? So 30-day use is absolutely one of the things we pay attention to. So if we contextualize this triangle even more broadly, let's think about it. So let's look at the green parts and the yellow parts. So if 70 to 80% of youth, at least for this triangle, is considering 12th graders across the country. And again, this may change depending on what state you're in. So the colors may adjust in terms of you may have more or less depending on what your state. We're housed in the state of Utah. We're in Salt Lake City, so I'm pretty familiar with the state-based estimates in our state, and I know this would vary depending on what substance we were looking at, and also the state we were in. So I just wanted to point that out, but these are just averages. So, but anyway, but one of the fundamental questions is, why are some youth in the green part of the triangle, and why are some youth in the yellow part of the triangle? What is it that places them in one part of the triangle or another? Another way to consider it is how do we support youth to stay in the green part of the triangle, the no use part? And how do we support youth who find themselves in the yellow part of the triangle to get them down to the green part of the triangle? Well, those are kind of elements of prevention and considerations conceptually of things that we want to consider and talk about. So the other thing I want to point out, and when I do a different lecture, when I do a treatment-based lecture, there's also, I think you can see my cursor here, this top part of the triangle, which I don't have on this slide, but I do in others when I do other presentations, is what I call the red part of the triangle. And that's for youth at the very top who are probably going to meet criteria for a substance use disorder per se. And we're probably going to use different intervention and different treatment strategies perhaps for that. And that's time for another conversation, but our focus today is really on prevention. So really the goal here is really to figure out why youth are in one part of the triangle versus the other, and how we can influence youth to either stay in one part of the triangle or move to another part, okay? So conceptually, that is the point of today's webinar and kind of where we're going. And we're going to be looking at that from a social, behavioral, and also a biological perspective. Okay, sorry, let me move back here. Okay, so one of the areas that you probably are pretty familiar with, and I'm not going to tend to spend a ton of time, but I'm just going to orientate ourselves to, are risk and protective factors. So these are considered what are more in the biological or I'm sorry, not the biological, the social or behavioral aspect. So a risk factor could be something like the availability of a substance, which is the red ellipse there. An outcome of that is the more available substances are, may be related to the likelihood that a youth is more likely to use a particular substance, okay? However, we also know that it's protective factors that can buffer these risk factors. So let's extend our model a little bit more. In terms of a risk factor, if it's the availability of substance, a buffer or a protective factor or something that may prevent the use of a substance could be something like when the youth perceives that using this substance is a bad thing. In other words, they perceive that there's a harmful effect of using the substance. And what we know from the literature is actually when youth perceive substances to be more harmful, they're less likely to use them. So we know that risk and protective factors play out. They're not always direct opposites of each other. Sometimes they may be mediating. They may be involved in mediating relationships, as was kind of what's shown here in this example. But we do know there's different things, different risks and protections out there. And these are the things that most of us tend to be fairly familiar with. And so let's spend just a little bit of time talking about these. So some of the risk factors that you probably already know, and one of the things I want to point out is that these are not exhaustive by any means, right? I've listed certain things here. There's probably others you can think of and so on. And these are also not exclusive to substance use. You know, other problem behavior, other behaviors and so forth these risk factors are interconnected. But let's just go over some. So some of the risk factors we know in terms of the individual and peer domains is the early use of substances. The earlier someone starts using a substance, unfortunately predicts later substance use as they grow into adulthood. Early and persistent problem behaviors. If we work with youth and the earlier they engage in problem behaviors, that's unfortunately a good predictor for later problem behavior. Favorable attitudes towards substances, rebelliousness, peer use of substances. If you hang around other youth who are using substances. I have parents a lot of time ask me if their youth is using a substance, and I say, I don't know. I don't necessarily know your youth. But I say one of the things we know from the literature, if they're hanging around others who are using substances, there's a higher likelihood that they are as well as genetic susceptibility. Do you have someone closer in your family tree who has a substance use issue and so forth? Family factors tend to be things like family conflict, problems with family management, if parents have favorable attitudes towards substances, and also a family history. So any of these things just increase the likelihood that a youth will find themselves using substance. Doesn't mean they're going to. No, it doesn't. Doesn't mean it's absolutely the trajectory that they're going to take. No, it doesn't. And we don't know like how many of these things make up. Is there 5? Is there 6? Or how many of these risk factors does it really take? Or is there a combination between risk and protective factors to quote, have a youth using substances? We don't know. What we do know is having more of these things is more predictive of substance use. Now, the flip side of that, and the kind of the prevention side of that, is protective factors. And we can think about these things as things that we can kind of enhance to protect from using substances. So one of the things here is a social, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and moral competence. Well, that's a mouthful, right? So what does that mean? So to make that more clear, it's things around making good decisions, problem solving in ways that lead to good decisions or lead to good outcomes. And these things are really tied into the parts of the brain that we're going to be talking about today. So what about adolescent development in terms of biological development that we know what happens to the brain that also influence things like how we make emotional decisions, how we control or regulate our emotions, how we make behavioral and cognitive decisions, and so forth. Also turns out that other protective factors are our level of self-efficacy. If adolescents believe they can actually do things, which is an important factor. And if you remember from Social Psychology 101, Albert Bandura taught us a lot about social self-efficacy, and that's a pretty important concept. The more we believe we can do something, the higher likelihood we're actually going to do it successfully. Spirituality tends to be one as well. It doesn't matter which spirituality group you belong to, or you're related to, or you're affiliated with. It's more about having a connection and a bonding experience. Resiliency is another one. We all know that adolescents are faced with things that they have to overcome at certain times, but having the resiliency and having opportunities to overcome and learn from those are really important. Some other protective factors: family, school, and community, opportunities for pro-social involvement. So having outlets to do things that are positive, that don't involve substance use, like sports or other things. Recognition for positive behavior so that they're recognized when they do positive things, and also bonding. This kind of integrates into a lot of other things, but having connections, having positive connections, whether in the 3 major socializing agents for adolescents tend to be school, peers, and the family. And we know that if you have positive connections in all 3 of those, that's great. That tends to lead to better outcomes. But if you at least have positive connections in one of those areas, that tends to produce better outcomes than having no positive connections in any of those areas. And as well as having healthy beliefs and standards for behavior. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these risk and protective factors, because my guess is you probably already had a lot of information about that, and that's okay. What I anticipate is we probably don't talk enough about adolescent brain development. All right, so we're going to tie these things together: the risk and protective factor, the social behavioral piece with the biological piece. So let's spend some time talking about adolescent brain development. What we know about the brain development is pretty cool, because neuroscience has taught us in the past 25 years or so, there's some common things that are common knowledge. And when I do this presentation live, one of the things I ask is, what is one of the things we know about adolescent brain development, or brain development in general? And I tell you, within a second, someone pops up their hand and says, one of the things we know is that the brain doesn't fully develop until a person's mid-20s. That's great that we know these things. So the brain isn't fully formed in adolescence. It's forming, right? And we'll talk about what do we mean by it's forming and so forth. So the cool thing about neuroscience and the advent of technology in the past, quarter century or so, it teaches us more about how the brain functions and informs what we do around our interventions and our prevention strategies for adolescents. So by and large, the brain develops from top to bottom and from back to front. And overall, the brain is a specialized, right, organ. It's really important and complex organ. It's a specialized organ. And so which means the different parts have different functions, right? So you can see some of those listed here. The other thing we know that the brain is also interconnected. So even though different parts may be connected to different functions, we also know that the brain talks to each other. So it's a very efficient organ as well. And what do we mean by as the brain grows across time? Well, part of what we mean is the connections between neurons. And I don't have a neuron slide in this particular slide deck, but usually I show a neuron slide, and neurons are kind of the basic building blocks of the brain. And when we're born, we have about 80 to 100 billion neurons. And what happens across time, you know, from young childhood until our mid-20s, those neurons make better connections or become more efficient. And we want that to happen. Because if you think about our computer wiring and so forth, you know, we want better wires to make better connections with our brain so it can communicate in the different functions in the different areas that it needs to. And we want that to occur. We don't want any disruptions in that process. Okay, so what we're really talking about is the growth of neurons, or those interconnections between all those billions of neurons in the brain. Okay, so simply put, this is not gonna be a review of, you know, biology 101. This is gonna be a quick review of kind of major parts of the brain that we're gonna be talking about. So if we kind of start from the bottom and work up our way to the top, the brainstem is an important part, which is which I call the bottom part of the brain, or I just call it 3 different parts of the brain that we talk about in terms of here. The brainstem really helps with those autonomic processes, those things that we don't want to have to think about. It connects the brain to the body. It's important for things like respiration and blood pressure and digestion. Well, I don't want to have to think about respiration or digestion or blood pressure a lot. I just want my body to do those things. Well, that's what the brainstem really helps with. And it turns out that that's pretty functional, you know, when we're born, and continues to get more functional as we go. The other area of the brain, or the middle part of the brain, which we'll call the limbic area of the brain, is what we also consider the emotional part of the brain. Well, it turns out that one of the things we've learned is that during adolescence, this is clearly one of the areas of the brain that's still developing. So if you think about adolescence, if you have your own adolescents at home, which I do, or if you work with adolescents, you can think about what's going on during adolescence. It's fairly an emotional, tumultuous time. And so what we know about brain development is that's kind of what we should expect, because the limbic area, the emotional part of the brain, is, quote, what's coming online during that time. So what are some substructures within that? The amygdala, if you think about the fight and flight response, which gets activated. So if you work with adolescents and they automatically get angry or get sad, and part of what you're interacting with is the amygdala and the fight or flight. They're having to make decisions about what to do about this at any one particular time. The hippocampus, which is the connection to new memories and so forth. And also one of the things we know about this is forming new memories is really important. And we also know when folks use substances, that sometimes interferes with forming new memories. And that's why we think it happens in part because it's this middle part of the brain. And the hypothalamus, the other part, working with adolescents, the hormonal part of the brain, in terms of thinking about how hormones get distributed, how they're getting regulated in relation to fight or flight or forming new memories and so forth. So if you work with adolescents, and sometimes they kind of seem all over the place, in part, that's kind of what we expect, because we know this middle part of the brain, this emotional part of the brain, the limbic area is really starting to come online during that time. The other thing I want to go back to is that the amygdala, especially connected to the hippocampus, also deals with the stress response in the brain. So when adolescents find things that may stress them out in terms of the fight or flight, right? They experience things that they fear, or they need to determine whether I can engage with this or not. What that does is it activates the middle part of the brain. And technically what it does by having that stress response, it sends out neurotransmitters and hormones and chemicals that slows down the top part of the brain, which is that next part, which is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, and the prefrontal cortex is really important because that's the thinking part of the brain, or the cognitive part of the brain, or the planful decision-making and problem solving. You also may hear it referred to as the executive functioning part of the brain, but it's kind of that logical thinking aspect of the brain. So just in review real quickly, top part of the brain, logical kind of decision-making part, middle part of the brain, limbic or more emotional part, and then the brainstem. Okay, but really the middle part of the brain is coming on during adolescence, and that top part of the brain, in terms of what we talked about, doesn't get fully developed into the mid-20s. And what we really mean, it's the interconnectedness between the neurons. Okay. But here's what I want to point out. So even though I said all that and so forth, there's another thing I want to point out. And what I want to say here is that there is individual variability in that development. So even say that we say the middle part of the brain, gets developed in adolescence, top part of the brain up to the mid-20s, it turns out that that's on average. So if we look here and we see this graph, and we see across the bottom that age is on the bottom. So basically it's 5-year-old to 35-year-olds. And then this accuracy piece is a cognitive control task. So basically the better decisions you're making, the higher across age. So the correlation here is as you get older, you tend to make better decisions, which would kind of fall in line with the idea that as our brain matures, that top part of the brain kind of kicks in. However, what we see here is this blue line, that's an average, right? And what we know from averages, it doesn't tell us the whole story about individual variability. So what I'm really trying to point out is in the brain development scheme, there's a lot of individual variability. So what you can see here, if I just scroll down here or point to the 15-year-old, you can see that some 15-year-olds are above the line and are making better decisions than some 25-year-olds, which is the dot right here, okay, as an example. So one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, why is that the case? Why do some 15-year-olds make better decisions and vice versa if everything progresses in the same way? Well, in general, everything tends to progress in some way, but we know there's a lot of individual variability because there could be disruption in brain development. And what are reasons for that disruption? So that's kind of where we're going. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out, and I've kind of alluded to it already, is that as the brain's maturing, and I talked about the emotional part of the brain or the limbic part of the brain that's really coming online during adolescence, one of the ways we socialize that, we think about it, is this thing called puberty. Now, most of us, all of us have, I'm assuming all of us here have gone through puberty. It's a place where we've all had to go through, but probably never want to go back to. But it's a typical component of adolescent development, right? And puberty, we really kind of think about this is it's a biological marker as well as a social marker. So there's expectations when adolescents hit puberty. So, and I like to give you what I call factoids, or just a little information, and you can use these things at your next backyard barbecue and so forth. Well, it turns out that currently the average age of puberty is about 12 years old. As we're 100 years ago, it used to be 17 years old. And the reason for that, there's theories about that, and maybe changes in the food and growth hormones and so forth. And there's no conclusive evidence. But what I really want to point out as a social construct, what we anticipate adolescents can do or youth can do when they hit puberty changes. And when I do this presentation live, I ask, what are the things that we typically expect that adolescents will do during puberty? What I hear a lot of was, well, change their behavior, act more mature, so on and so forth. And what I'm really trying to point out here is, does that match with what we know about the brain development? Okay, so let's take that even a step further. So here's some age-based markers of adolescent development. For example, it turns out that when you turn 13, and in some cultures we celebrate the age of 13, and that's kind of the marker for puberty, or moving into young adulthood or adulthood. And so our expectations of what adolescents do changes. But does that make any sense? Or does that have any rationale in the brain science? Not necessarily, right? But it turns out that at 13, you turn into a teenager. At 16, most states, not all, and I have a slide to show you, but most states say you can drive, okay? Although we know that car rental companies and insurance companies say that's probably not a good day or a good idea based on their estimates, because actually in most places you can't rent a car until you're at least 25 or 26. And we also know if you're a parent that has teenagers on your insurance, which I do, we know that jacks up the insurance rates a lot because they're a bad bet, unfortunately, right? But those are based on probabilities and so forth. At age 18, it turns out you turn into an adult, whatever that means. And you can vote, you can join the military, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't have any basis in kind of what we know about the brain science. And between 18 to 21, depending on what state you're in or what territory you're in, you can use tobacco products legally. And at 21, you can use, most places, you can use alcohol legally. But again, does that have any relevance for where we're at and what we know about the brain science? Not necessarily. These are social and legislative constructs that we developed, but don't necessarily match what we know about biological development. So that's really all I'm trying to point out here. This is a little factoid for you that I thought I put in just for fun. And what this shows is that even driving ages across the US are not all the same. The dark or the blue, which is most of the country, indicates that 16 is at the age when you can get a license. Some states are different. You can see the states in yellow is actually age 15. The South Dakota there in the green is actually age 14 years, 3 months is what I pulled out. And the oldest age currently in the nation is all the way to the right, which is here, which is New Jersey, and that's 17. So there is some variability in terms of that, but I'm even suggesting, are the ages at which we provide licenses or which a youth can get a license, does that even match what we know about the brain science? Probably not. Okay. But here's some good news, right? So if we flip that a little bit and think about when adolescents make risky decisions, even though we've just said the top part of the brain doesn't fully come online until a person's mid-20s and so forth, what does that do and so on? Well, here's a study that is not related to substance use. It's just related to adolescents making risky decisions. And so what we can see across the bottom is that there's age. So basically, or this is the x-axis from 10 to 24, so across time. And here, this is standardized tendencies, which shorthand for that is just saying making risky decisions. So what we actually want to see is this getting lower or moving towards zero across time. We want adolescents to make less risky decisions, right? Even though we say that the brain development, the brain isn't fully developed until a person's mid-20s, those interconnections and so forth. So let's take a look at this a little more closely. So what we know is the black line here, and what's we'll call the known line, is that when an adolescent has more information about a risky decision they're making, or the properties are known about the risky decision, they're making more informed choices. And it turns out that the capacity or the likelihood they're going to make a risky decision decreases across time. Okay, so put another way, when they have more information about the decision they're making, the decisions tend to be less risky. Okay. When adolescents, now here's another line for you though, this is the blue line. When adolescents don't know the properties of making the risky decision, so they're making a decision, but it's ambiguous, whether this thing is going to turn out good or bad or indifferent. They also tend to peak out around 16 to 20 years of age, right? But at some point they tend to drop. So the idea here would say that even when they don't know what are all the situations, what are all the complications, what are all the aspects involved in making risky decisions, they tend to peak out, but they will decrease across time. And what we're suggesting here is there's probably things related to experiences, making other decisions before that are similar, that gives them information about how to make these decisions. So their risky decision making actually decreases as well and starts to get closer to the black line. Okay. Well, it tends to be that there's a subset of adolescents, which is referred to as this red line, that are insensitive to either. If they know the risks or they don't know the risk, it doesn't really seem to matter. And these are youth, but a smaller proportion of youth that tend to make risky decisions earlier on. And those tend to peak out between 12 to 16. And even as they get older with experience, they don't drop to the point of either the blue line or the red line. Okay, so if we think about this and we go back to the triangle that we talked about a few slides back, those would be the kids probably at the top, very top red part of the triangle, which I didn't have in the triangle, but I alluded to, that are going to have difficult time regardless, that we could probably pick out early and also probably need more intervention, or more strategic intervention. It turns out, though, that most youth are probably going to fall on either this black line or this blue line, which if we think back to our triangle are going to be the green part or the yellow part of the triangle, which we can actually do some prevention in. Okay, all that said, here is the big take-home message. The more information, the better information we have about the decisions that we're making, the better decisions we make. Okay, I've worked with a number of youth, and it turns out, at least from my experience, is that youth are more likely to research the next iPhone purchase they're going to make than they're going to research the next substance they're going to put in their body, even though the substance can have a more dramatic effect than their iPhone purchase. Okay, but what this is suggesting is that when youth make decisions, when they have better decision-making capacity, when they know more about what the decision they're making, they make better decisions. And that's kind of is intuitive sense for us as well. When we want to find out about something, we tend to, it's easier now than it ever has been. We can go and research it, look on Google or whatever our, WebMD or whatever our favorite platform is, and find out more because we tend to make better decisions when we have better information. We also know observationally that adolescents in general, tend to make riskier decisions compared to younger age groups and adults. So remember what I said before in terms of the middle part of the brain, what's developing. So one of the things we anticipate and we expect is that middle part of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic area, the hypothalamus and so forth, part of those things are pulling for things like risky decision making and impulsivity and so forth. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So part of that is just typical normal development, which we expect to have happen. And we don't necessarily want to curtail it. We want adolescents to make good decisions that don't have, unfortunately, long-lasting negative consequences like substance use. So what we're going to consider now is kind of that reward pathway of the brain, or what are some of the things that are coming online when we think about the middle part of the brain. Okay. So one of the questions that I get a lot is what happens when substances interact with the brain. So this is one of the ways that we think about this in terms of we think about the reward pathway of the brain. And think about that green ellipse there where it's at. It's really the middle part of the brain. Remember I talked about the limbic part of the brain? And those two structures there that are kind of the little circles that have the dots on them are considered the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. I don't need you to know that, but basically I just wanted you to know that this middle part of the brain that's getting activated when drugs are used, essentially. And this reward pathway is really important because what we know that from just typical studies is the reward pathway gets activated when we do typical behaviors. So for example, when we eat, reward pathway gets activated. When we get nurturing, reward pathway gets activated. When we have sex, reward pathway gets activated. And so what's happening at a neurotransmitter level is the reward pathway is getting activated because the levels of a neurotransmitter that probably many of you are familiar with called dopamine increases. And that's what those little dots here kind of represent. It's the idea is that when we do things and the reward pathway gets activated with increases of dopamine, it makes us want to do it again. And it's sending messages into the reward pathway because that's a pleasing area for us. And it's also sending messages, as you can see, to the red part, which is the prefrontal cortex, and saying, do this again, do this again. Well, it turns out there's interconnections there, and we're going to talk about some of these, but let's think about, so what I just said is just in typical behaviors, the reward pathway gets activated. That's good because we want to eat, we want to procreate, all those things. Okay, well, it turns out that when we use substances like heroin, like cocaine, like nicotine, like alcohol, and most substances have similar reactions in the reward pathway. As you can see, though, some substances have more direct access to the reward pathway and some substances have more indirect. And that's one of the reasons we think, of course, we talk about addiction, why are some behaviors with substances so hard to change. So what happens is when we use substances, it increases or it overactivates the reward pathway by flooding it with dopamine above and beyond what we would normally anticipate just from eating food or whatever it may be. Okay. Well, the problem with that is the overactivation of dopamine, the brain gets used to it. Also, remember what I said about the limbic area in the middle part of the brain. One of the things that happens when the middle part of the brain is overreacts or gets overstimulated, it also creates a stress response in part of the brain based on the amygdala, the fight or flight response. And so one of the things we know that happens from that is stress hormones such as, because remember we talked about the hypothalamus, stress hormones such as cortisol get released. So this middle part of the brain is getting overactivated, it's getting overstimulated, releases some stress hormone, which typically is good. And most opportunities is good, right? In terms of if we come across a stressful situation. So for example, if we put our hand on a hot stove, we automatically move it back, right? We don't sit there and think about, maybe I should move my hand off the hot stove. So what's happening in that instance is we put our hand on a hot stove is our middle part of the brain kicks in. It's a protective part, the fight or flight response saying, don't do this. It releases a stress response, right? And part of that is the cortisol and releases the stress and the cortisol, which exaggerates that amygdala. But also one of the things we know what happens is it slows down the prefrontal cortex, which is that top part of the brain. So think about this. You put your hand on a hot stove, your brain automatically tells you take it off because you don't want to get burned. And if you think about it, you're not spending a lot of time to cognitively think about what should I do? Should I not do this? And that's okay because that's protective. We don't want the brain to do that, right? And the reason we don't want the brain to do that because the more time we spend thinking about it, the more burned our hands are going to get. Well, that's a similar consequence in terms of what happens when we take substances is the top part of the brain slows down, in part related to that stress response. Cortisol gets released, top part of the brain slows down. So if you think about it, when we're under the influence of substances, we are not making our best decisions, right? It's hard to make good decisions. It's hard to have rational thought, in part because the brain is doing what it's supposed to do. It's slowing down the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so the theory, the big take-home message here is that long-term use or use of substances, especially during key times, right, of critical brain development, of which we know adolescence is one, disrupts the normal developmental process of the brain. That's a theory, right? And the idea is that use of substances during adolescence will over-exaggerate that activity in the middle part of the brain and slow down activity in the top part of the brain, which will prevent those neuronal connections from making the most efficient connections they can. And that's one of the theories why we say it can disrupt brain development. And that is in part what we're thinking about it. So clinically, some psychologists, and clinically, if you work with adults who have been using substances for long periods of time, you may recognize that sometimes, just these are from clinical observations, that making decisions seems harder for them than for someone else who hasn't used substances for a long period of time. And so part of what we think is that there's been some disruption in the top part of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, okay? So it's kind of a big take-home point there. So to make this even more clear, remember this is our brain, this is the dopamine reward pathway. As I said before, this is the nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area, prefrontal cortex. I don't need you to know those, I just want you to really more consider that there's a reward pathway there. If we look at this over here, remember what I said about when we engage in kind of typical behaviors, food. So this is the reward pathway. When we engage in eating food, which most of us like to do, dopamine is released, right? And the dopamine is released and it says, this is a good thing, your body gets sated, and then your brain says, yeah, we should do this again when we want to feel good and we want to, we want to make sure we have food and so forth. Well, it turns out that when we use substances, and some substances will overstimulate this reward pathway more than others. Cocaine tends to be the one that has pretty exaggerated properties. It floods the reward pathway. So if you just look at the dots here, there's more of them that occur in this reward pathway by using cocaine. Well, that's problematic in part because our reward pathway, our brain will say, I want more of that, I want more of that, right? So if you think about it, it's a clinical term that we use called tolerance. When you want more of something to get the same effect, that's considered tolerance, right? So in part, what's going on with your brain is it's saying, I want more of that to maintain this effect. Because your threshold, one of the theories is the threshold within your reward pathway, the dopamine threshold resets. So you're going to need more of that to have the same experience. So the other part of that is when you think about, well, I'm going to take this away. So if you consider smoking and nicotine is another way. And one of the reasons that's so hard to quit is when, or most substances, when we take it away, it decreases that level of dopamine and your body reacts to that. It's a neurochemical reaction in your brain and it's saying, I don't like that. And that's considered withdrawal because your body is saying, I don't want you to take away that level of dopamine. I like that exaggerated effect and so forth. So the theory here is that basically that's what we're influencing when we take substances. We're over-exaggerating and under-exaggerating that reward pathway with the levels of dopamine. Some suggestion that we may reset that. So because one of the common questions is, well, if I stop taking it, will I ever be able to kind of go back to normal? What we know clinically speaking is sometimes people indicate that after multiple years of substance use and so forth, it's hard for them to feel the same pleasurable effects they normally would have felt, or they may have dull, kind of a dulled sense of, or a dulled emotional experience from what they normally experience. But we know that there's incredible plasticity in the brain. But the key thing here is a lot of these are theories, so we don't know like how much it takes to have that effect, how much it takes to disrupt brain development. Does it take a 6-pack a day? Does it take a 6-pack a week, and so forth? So it's kind of like when you're using substances, especially during those critical key times in adolescent development, you don't know, right? So it's the same thing with this reward pathway. Okay, so let's bring all of this home. So I want to put it all together. So basically, when we think about what we just learned, right, what you probably already knew about risk and protective factors, and hopefully what we added on around adolescent brain development and so forth, or brain development in general, is that adolescent risk-taking, impulsivity, and cognitive control are things that we typically expect during adolescent development. Risk-taking, engaging in sensation-seeking behaviors, and as I said before, adolescents tend, just observationally, they tend to engage in more of these things than either younger or older age groups do. Also, this is correlated with impulsivity, doing things without thinking about it and so forth. Well, think about what's really developing during adolescence, that middle part of the emotional part of the brain, given that risk-taking and impulsivity is really tied into that middle part of the brain. And what we actually know, the reason I pointed out the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, because what we know is risk-taking and sensation-seeking and impulsivity are connected to those structures in the brain, what we've seen from studies. So what I'm trying to say here is that those things are what we expect to have happen during adolescence. So we shouldn't try to get rid of all risk-taking or impulsivity at all, right? Because those are fundamentally functional things. That's how adolescents learn and engage. What we really want is to increase some of that cognitive control, which is that next step there, because we know the brain development at the top part of the prefrontal cortex isn't something that's fully developed. So what do we do, right? You know, even brain surgeons can't go in and change that, right? So we have to wait for experience to take hold. We have to wait for the learning process to take hold. And we want to develop things like consequential thinking, decision-making, and problem solving. And there's no reason as preventionists or interventionists or whatever role we have, we can't work with adolescents to enhance that prefrontal cortex in the context of knowing that that middle part of the brain is still developing. Okay, so that's kind of the normal, typical trajectory that we typically expect. So here's what some of the things that we can do, because the whole point of this lecture was to think about what are implications for now what we know about the social, behavioral, and now biological aspects of adolescent development that will help inform us in terms of what we can do in prevention. So here we go. Prevention, forming prevention practice. Prevention is clearly important. Right? I think we all know this, even though as a field we don't spend enough time. I would argue that we don't spend enough time on prevention, that we should spend more. And we also know that earlier is better. You know, some of the things I pointed out earlier in this presentation, I was suggesting that. There's no reason to believe that we should wait. We shouldn't wait, actually. We should do earlier better. The more information, the more correct and accurate information, the better decisions you make. Either we want to prevent substance use in the first place, we want to help kids, support them in the green part of the triangle, right? Or if they're already at the yellow part of the triangle, what can we do to support them to help them get down to the green part of the triangle, instead of moving up to what I consider the red part of the triangle, which again I alluded to, but it's not on my slide. Okay, so prevention is really important. First take-home messages, that message. The second thing is there's no reason that we shouldn't teach about the changes in the brain and the body. Developmental growth periods, we know what's going to happen, right? And all of us have gone through it. And now we know more about the biology and so forth and the expectations and how the social and behavioral aspects don't always match up with what we know about the brain science. So why not teach kids about what they're going to go through and how to manage those things? And also teach kids about the effects of substances on the brain and body. Remember what I keep saying, the better information you have, the better decisions you make. Working individually with youth, which I've done when we've asked youth what are things that they want to know about substances. You know, we ask them, what are things that you learn in schools and so forth? And they tell us, well, we learn, you know, just say no or don't use them. Like, so what are the things that you want to know? And they say, we actually want to know what they do to your brain and your body, which actually makes sense. And we also know from the protective factor literature that knowing more about how substances harm your body decreases the likelihood that youth are actually going to use that particular substance. Some other things, right? Some other things that we've already kind of touched on, but again, bringing them home. Teaching about emotional regulation, that middle part of the brain. We know that limbic area, that middle part of the brain is really coming online during adolescence. Is there any reason we shouldn't teach youth how to emotionally regulate anxiety around things like anxiety, anger, negative moods? So I know when I work with youth and we do things called like anger management and so forth, I say, you know, count to 10 or whatever, and they laugh at me because I think that's ridiculous. But you know what I do is sometimes I frame it as I teach them the brain science, because there's no reason why you can't teach the brain science. I've taught this stuff to as young as 6th graders, and I just draw 3 circles. You know, I don't even draw the rest of the structures because I don't need to. And I say the middle part does this, the bottom part does this, the top part does this, and conceptually they get it, right? And I talk about, well, instead of counting to 10, think about you're giving yourself time in order for the neurochemicals to rebalance. So the neurochemicals in the top part of your brain is saying, slow down when you get angry. So give yourself 10 seconds so those neurochemicals can balance and those come back down so you can have a rational thought again, or you can think about what you're going to do instead of just reacting in the middle part of your brain and punching the student because you're mad at them. So you may have other options and so forth. So contextually, you can think about how to present this based on the age of the adolescents you're working with, but there's no reason why we can't teach emotional regulation. Another component here, we know from the top part of the brain, there's absolutely no reason why we can't teach problem solving, decision-making skills, understanding consequences, choices, planning, and decision. Typically in schools, we teach this indirectly. So for example, like algebra class, we teach how to solve for X, but how do you solve for X when you're at a party and someone offers you substances, right? How do you solve for X in the real world? How does that make sense? And what are some of these situations you're going to be involved in? And so forth. But explicitly teaching these problem solving and decision-making skills, because we know, I showed you on one of the slides, there's great individual variability in terms of some 15-year-olds will make better decisions than 25-year-olds. Why can't we work towards enhancing that prefrontal cortex and increasing the opportunity to make those connections earlier on? And lastly, I just want to point out, because our brain and our development is influenced by the environment, and one concept of this is called epigenetics, is that we interact with our environment, right? Our experiences interact with the environment. We learn from our environment. Our brain is influenced by our environment. There's no reason why not to teach kids about things like peer pressure, social media, advertising, things that influence them. And this is specifically targeted towards substance use. Again, you can broaden this and so forth to talk about other things, but there's no reason why we can't teach some of these things. So I know a lot of times I get questions about, well, what program should I use? And I'm kind of not, my goal here is not to sell you any one particular program. My goal is to say, here's some principles based on what we know, social, behavioral, and biologically, of whatever program or whatever intervention or strategy you're using. These principles probably should be embedded in them, because those are some of the things that we know that are going to have an influence, and some of the things that are going to be impactful for related to adolescent development. Okay, so those are the big take-home messages there. I know I did that in a brief amount of time, and I'm sorry to run through all that. But the other thing that I wanted to say is there's no reason why you can't share this information with adolescents. There's no secrets here, there's no mysteries here. We know this stuff. And so one of the things we try to do is produce things that you can share with adolescents, or our little quick snippets of information that we have. One of the platforms that we're doing that in most recently is on video platforms and so forth. And we've been building things for social media platforms. And we just wanted to share one of the videos. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but this is a less than 2-minute video that basically encapsulates everything I just said in the last 50 minutes. So let me play this for you. This brief video on the effects of substances on the teen brain is presented by the Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center, funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The brain is a complex organ. Let's consider it from 3 different parts. The cortex area, which is the top part of the brain, is responsible for how we think and how we. So anyway, you get the point. But that's a less than 2-minute video. This just goes over many of the things that we talked about, but gives you a context in which to talk about how the brain influences by development, what we know about development. It can also be influenced by substances. We're going to make this video available to you so you can use it. I want to provide some opportunity for questions and so forth. And so that's the end of my overall presentation. I really want to say thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Email us if you have any questions. Yeah, thank you.